Jonah Riggs stared at the 10 copper coins in his palm, the sweat on his forehead cold in the morning air. 10 cents. He was buying an entire train for 10 cents. He looked from the coins to the hulking mass of rusted steel and peeling paint. Then he looked at Thaddeus Sloan. "You sure about this, Thaddeus?" Thaddeus didn't look at him. His eyes were scanning the tree line, wild and panicked, like a rabbit that's heard a wolf howl. His knuckles were white where he gripped a worn leather satchel. "Take it or leave it," Thaddeus snapped, his voice a dry rasp. "I need it gone. Now." This wasn't right. This wasn't Thaddeus Sloan at all. The Thaddeus Jonah knew would haggle over the price of a single nail. He was the kind of man who charged folks a penny just to water their horses at his trough. Now he was practically giving away a locomotive and half a dozen cars. Giving away tons of solid iron. Jonah's pockets were nearly empty. He had exactly 11 cents to his name. Winter was coming on fast, and 11 cents wouldn't buy a sack of flour, let alone see him and Dora through the cold months. This train, even sold for scrap, was a lifeline. It was a deal too good to be true. And deals like that usually ended badly, but he was desperate. "Deal," Jonah said, his voice quiet. He dropped the 10 coins into Thaddeus's trembling, outstretched hand. The moment the metal touched his skin, a change came over Thaddeus. His shoulders, which had been tensed up to his ears, sagged with a relief so profound it was almost shocking. He shoved the coins into his pocket without even looking at them, and turned to leave, his boots crunching in the dry grass. He took 3 quick steps, then stopped, his back still to Jonah. "Jonah," he said, his voice low and strange. "Whatever you find in those cars, just remember where you got 'em from." Before Jonah could ask what he meant, Thaddeus was walking away. Fast. He didn't look back, just plunged toward the woods, his pace getting quicker until he was almost running. Within a minute, he was gone, swallowed by the shadows of the trees, leaving Jonah alone with his 10-cent train. He stood there for a long time, the silence of the clearing pressing in on him. The sheer wrongness of the whole thing made his skin crawl. Thaddeus hadn't just sold him a train. He'd sold him a secret, and Jonah had a sinking feeling it was a dangerous one. He took a deep breath and pulled himself up into the first car. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust and rust. He expected to find it empty, maybe a few stray bits of forgotten cargo. Instead, his boot hit something that wasn't solid. A floorboard. It shifted under his weight. He knelt down, his heart starting to beat a little faster. The board was loose, slightly raised at one end. He could see fresh pry marks along the edge, as if someone had lifted it recently and put it back in a hurry. He hooked his fingers under the edge and pulled. The board came up easily, and Jonah forgot how to breathe. Underneath, nestled in a hidden compartment that seemed to run the entire length of the car, were coins. Gold coins. They were stacked in neat, tight rows, gleaming with a soft, buttery light in the dim car. It wasn't a handful of coins. It was a river of them. More gold than he had ever seen. More than he'd ever imagined existed in one place. His first thought was pure, dizzying joy. He was rich. Rich beyond his wildest dreams. But his second thought came cold and sharp as a winter wind. Thaddeus. This is what he'd been running from. He hadn't been selling a train. He'd been trying to get rid of this gold. And now, whatever Thaddeus had been so terrified of, it wouldn't be looking for him anymore. It would be looking for Jonah. His hands shook as he reached into the compartment and lifted a handful of the coins. They were heavy, much heavier than he expected. The markings on them were strange, not like any currency he'd ever seen from the Territorial Bank. These were foreign, old, and they felt important. He scrambled to the next car, his mind racing. He found another loose floorboard. He lifted it. More gold. The next car, the same thing. And the next. Each car had a secret floor, and each secret floor was filled to the brim with a fortune that defied belief. It was as if someone had methodically, carefully converted a king's ransom into solid wealth and hidden it away. He sat back on his heels in the fourth car, surrounded by an impossible treasure, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of light from the grimy windows. There was enough gold here to buy the whole town. Maybe the whole territory. But the questions were screaming in his head now, louder than the ringing in his ears. Why would Thaddeus sell this? Why not just take the gold and disappear? He could have lived like an emperor for the rest of his life. Instead, he'd looked like a man running for his life, desperate to unload the very thing that held this incredible fortune. It made no sense. He had to tell Dora, his wife. But how? News like this would travel through their small town like a plague. Gold made good men greedy, and greedy men dangerous. He needed a plan. He needed to understand what he had stumbled into. As he was about to climb out of the car, something glinted under one of the dusty seats. It wasn't gold. He reached down and picked it up. It was a small, tarnished brass plate, the kind you might see on a fine piece of furniture. It had fallen between the cracks of the floorboards. He wiped the grime off with his thumb and read the elegant script engraved into the metal. Property of E. Redmond. Mountain Rail Company. The name meant nothing to him. E. Redmond. But the plate was well made, the engraving deep. Whoever this E. Redmond was, he'd been a man of means. This was his train, before it somehow fell into the hands of a terrified Thaddeus Sloane. Jonah slipped the nameplate into his pocket. He carefully replaced every floorboard, making sure they looked exactly as he'd found them. He'd come back tomorrow, with a wagon and tools, and move the gold. Tonight, he had to go home. He had to figure out what to do. The walk back to his cabin felt different. Every snap of a twig in the woods made him jump. Every shadow seemed to hold a pair of watching eyes. He'd gone out that morning hoping to buy a few dollars worth of scrap metal. Now he was walking home with a secret that felt heavier than all the gold in the world. He saw his cabin through the trees, smoke curling from the stone chimney. And he saw Dora, standing on the small porch. Her arms were crossed, and even from a distance he could see the worry etched on her face. Something was wrong. "Jonah!" she called out as he got closer, her voice tight with anxiety. "Thaddeus Sloane was here, looking for you." Jonah's blood ran cold. "He said he made a mistake," Dora continued, her voice dropping to a near whisper as he stepped onto the porch. "A terrible mistake with that train. He wants to buy it back." "What did you tell him?" Jonah asked, his own voice sounding distant. "That you weren't home. But Jonah, he didn't look right. He looked scared to death. What kind of mistake could make a man that frightened?" Jonah felt the brass nameplate in his pocket, its edges pressing into his palm. He didn't know, but he knew one thing for sure. Whatever mistake Thaddeus thought he'd made, it was far, far too late to fix it now. For 3 days, Thaddeus Sloane didn't leave the small, dusty office above his general store. He paced back and forth, the floorboards groaning under his weight, wearing a path in the wood. Jonah Riggs had refused to see him. Every time Thaddeus had gone to the man's cabin, Dora had met him at the door with a polite but firm, "He's not here." He knew she was lying. He knew Jonah was in there, hiding with his gold. The 10 cents Jonah had paid him sat on his desk. 10 miserable copper coins. He'd spent months planning it all. Months of careful, meticulous work. He'd been so sure he was the smartest man in the territory. And in one moment of blind panic, he'd outsmarted himself into ruin. A sharp knock on his office door made him jump so violently he nearly knocked over his chair. He froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Come in," he managed to croak. The door opened, and a woman stepped inside. She was dressed for travel, her dark dress coated in a fine layer of road dust, but she carried herself with an air of unshakable authority. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and they swept the room in a single glance before landing on him. They were eyes that missed nothing. "Mr. Sloane," she said, her voice cool and level, "I believe you have something that belongs to me." I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, but the tremor in his voice gave him away. She gave him a smile that held no warmth at all. "My father's train," she said, her voice dropping slightly. "The one you recently acquired. The Mountain Rail Company locomotive that disappeared 6 months ago, right after my father's unfortunate passing." Sweat beaded on Thaddeus's hairline. "I bought that train, fair and square, from the estate auction." "Is that so?" The woman walked to his desk and placed a leather portfolio on it. She opened it and pulled out a stack of official-looking documents. "Because according to these papers, signed by the territorial marshal himself, that train was never part of any estate sale. It was reported stolen from the rail yard, on the very same night my father died." The air in the room felt thick, heavy. He couldn't breathe. "I have a bill of sale," he protested weakly. "A forgery," she said, without even glancing at him. "And a poor one at that. But that isn't why I'm here, Mr. Sloane. I'm here to make you an offer." Despite the terror clawing at his throat, a flicker of his old greed sparked to life. "What kind of offer?" "Help me recover my father's property," she said, her sharp eyes boring into him. "And I will ensure you face no charges for your creative acquisition. Refuse, and the territorial marshal will be kicking down this door before the sun sets." His mind was spinning. She knew about the theft. But did she know what was inside the train? Her calm, businesslike manner suggested she didn't. She seemed to be after the locomotive itself, not its contents. This was his chance, his only chance. "The thing is," he said, choosing his words with the care of a man walking on thin ice, "I already sold it." For the first time, her composure faltered, just for a second. A crack in the perfect facade. "You sold it? To whom?" "Jonah Riggs, a local fella, for 10 cents." She stared at him, her expression a mixture of disbelief and contempt. 10 cents? You sold an entire locomotive for 10 cents? "It was damaged," he lied, scrambling for a plausible story. "Just scrap metal, really. Not worth much." "Mr. Sloane," she said, her voice dangerously quiet now, "that locomotive is worth over $3,000 in scrap metal alone. Why in God's name would you sell it for 10 cents? The question hung in the air like a hangman's noose. He was trapped. Any answer he gave would be a lie, and she would see right through it. If he told her anything close to the truth, he'd reveal his knowledge of the gold. But if he said nothing, his silence would be an admission of guilt. "Gambling debts," he blurted out. "I needed money fast. Didn't have time to find a real buyer." She studied his face for a long, silent moment. He could feel her gaze picking him apart, analyzing every bead of sweat, every twitch of his eye. "Where is Jonah Riggs?" she finally asked, her voice like chips of ice. "He has a cabin, a couple of miles east of town." She gathered her papers, her movements crisp and efficient. "Mr. Sloane," she said as she stood to leave, "I suggest you pray that Mr. Riggs is a more reasonable man than you are. Because if anything has happened to my father's property—" She paused at the door, turning to fix him with one last, withering glare. "Well, let's just say forgery will be the very least of your worries." The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Thaddeus alone in the suffocating silence. He sank into his chair, his legs suddenly unable to hold him. He hadn't solved his problem. He'd just given it a new name. Jonah Riggs. Florence Redmond found Jonah splitting firewood behind his small, sturdy cabin. The rhythmic thud of his axe was the only sound in the quiet afternoon. He was shirtless, his back and shoulders gleaming with honest sweat. When he saw her approaching, he paused, sinking the axe into the chopping block, and wiped his hands on a rag. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice polite but wary. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Riggs? My name is Florence Redmond. I believe you recently purchased a train from a Mr. Thaddeus Sloane." Jonah's expression tightened. "That's right. 10 cents. Paid in full." "I'm afraid there has been a serious misunderstanding," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "That train belonged to my late father, Edmund Redmond. It was stolen from our company rail yard 6 months ago." Stolen! The word landed like a stone in Jonah's gut. He thought of the brass nameplate in his pocket. E. Redmond. It felt like it was burning a hole through the fabric. "Sloane told me he bought it at an estate auction," Jonah said, though he knew it was a lie even as he said it. "Mr. Sloane lied to you," Florence stated simply. She held out the papers she'd shown Thaddeus. "These documents prove my family's ownership. My father built that locomotive. It was the pride of the Mountain Rail Company. It was taken the night he died, along with—" She paused, her sharp eyes studying his face, searching for a reaction. "Along with certain other property of great value." Jonah's mouth was suddenly as dry as dust. She knew. She had to know about the gold. "Ma'am, if what you say is true," he said, trying to keep his voice steady, "then I've been deceived as much as you. I paid for that train." 10 cents can hardly be considered good money for a $3,000 locomotive, Mr. Riggs. "It was everything I had," Jonah said, and the simple truth of it seemed to land with her. Her stern expression softened, just a fraction. She looked at his calloused hands, the simple cabin, the pile of wood he was splitting for the coming winter. She saw an honest man, not a criminal. He was just another victim of Thaddeus Sloane's schemes. "Mr. Riggs, I do not hold you responsible for Mr. Sloane's actions," she said, "but the train is my family's property. I need it returned." Jonah shifted his weight, the ground suddenly feeling unsteady beneath his feet. "The thing is, ma'am, I've already started working on it, cleaning it up. I was planning on using it to haul timber." "I am prepared to offer you $50, she said, "to compensate you for your 10 cents and any labor you've put in." It was a generous offer. $50 was more money than he usually saw in half a year. It would solve all his problems for the winter. All he had to do was say yes, and give up a fortune beyond imagining. But keeping it meant keeping stolen property. That would make him no better than Sloane. "I need some time," he said finally, "to think on it." Florence's eyes narrowed again, her brief moment of sympathy gone. "What is there to think about, Mr. Riggs? The train was stolen. The honorable thing to do is to return it." "The honorable thing," Jonah shot back, a hard edge in his voice, "would have been for Thaddeus Sloane to tell the truth from the start. Now I'm stuck in the middle of his lies and your claims. I have nothing but your word that these papers are even real." "Are you questioning my integrity, sir?" she asked, her voice dangerously low. "Right now, ma'am, I'm questioning everyone's. Yesterday, I owned a train. Today, you tell me I'm in possession of stolen goods. For all I know, someone else will ride up here tomorrow with a different story and a different set of papers." Her composure finally cracked. A flash of desperation showed in her eyes. "Mr. Riggs, that locomotive contains more than just metal. There are items hidden inside, items of great sentimental value to my family, things that can never be replaced." There it was. She knew something was hidden, but she called it sentimental value. Not gold. Was she lying to him, trying to trick him? Or did she genuinely not know the true nature of the treasure her father had hidden? "You'll have my answer tomorrow," Jonah said, his tone final. Her jaw tightened. "Very well, Mr. Riggs, but understand this. If you choose to keep what is not yours, you are choosing to become a thief yourself." She turned and walked away, leaving Jonah standing by the chopping block, the setting sun casting long, dark shadows across the yard. He was trapped, and the walls of the trap were closing in. That night, the small cabin felt like a cage. Jonah sat at the kitchen table, turning the brass nameplate over and over in his hands. The lamplight caught the engraved letters. E. Redmond. Dora sat across from him, mending a tear in one of his work shirts. The silence stretched on, broken only by the soft whisper of her needle through the cloth. "Are you going to tell me what's eating you, Jonah?" she finally asked, not looking up from her work. "That train," he said. "It's complicated." Complicated how? He chose his words carefully. He couldn't tell her about the gold. Not yet. The secret was too big, too dangerous. "A woman came by today. Says the train wasn't Thaddeus's to sell. Says it belonged to her father." Dora's needle stopped. "And you believe her?" "She had papers," he said. He held up the nameplate. "And I found this. Same name. Redmond." "So what are you going to do?" she asked, her eyes searching his. Before he could answer, a frantic, urgent knocking echoed from their front door. It wasn't a polite rap. It was the sound of someone in a desperate hurry. Jonah opened the door to find another woman standing on his porch. She was younger than Florence Redmond, with plain brown hair tied back from her face and intelligent, serious eyes. She looked exhausted, as if she'd been riding hard for days. "Mr. Riggs?" she asked, her voice breathless. "My name is Dora Easton. I'm a legal clerk from the territorial capital. I must speak with you about the locomotive." Jonah glanced back at his wife, then stepped outside, pulling the cabin door shut behind him. "Seems like everyone's interested in that old train all of a sudden." The young woman looked him straight in the eye. "That's because it's evidence, Mr. Riggs," she said, her voice dropping to a low, intense whisper. "Evidence in a murder investigation." The word hit Jonah like a punch to the gut. Murder. "Edmund Redmond didn't die of natural causes," she said, the words tumbling out of her in a rush. "He was killed, on the same night that train disappeared. My employer, the territorial government, has been investigating his death for months." The ground seemed to be tilting under Jonah's feet. "What kind of evidence is on that train?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Financial records, hidden documents. Mr. Redmond suspected one of his partners was embezzling money from the Mountain Rail Company. He was gathering the proof when he was murdered. We have reason to believe he hid that proof somewhere on his personal locomotive." Jonah's mind was reeling. First stolen property, now murder evidence. The gold he'd found, it wasn't a treasure. It was stolen money, embezzled funds, the motive for a man's murder. Florence Redmond had called it sentimental value. This woman was calling it proof of a crime. One of them was lying. Or maybe neither of them knew the whole truth. "Miss Easton," he said slowly, "if what you're saying is true, then I'm in a whole lot of trouble." "You are," she agreed, her expression grim. "The killer doesn't know you have the train yet, but when they find out—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Let my associates and I search the locomotive. First thing tomorrow morning. We'll find the evidence we need to identify the killer, and you'll be free of this whole mess." Jonah looked back at the warm, yellow light spilling from his cabin window. He could see Dora's silhouette as she moved about inside. His simple life. His honest life. It had never seemed more precious, or more fragile. "I'll think about it," he said. After she rode off into the darkness, Jonah stood on the porch for a long time. This was no longer about a fortune. It wasn't about what was honorable. It was about a killer. A killer who would do anything to keep the train's secrets buried. And Jonah was standing right on top of the grave. Sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin walls, Every rustle of leaves outside was the sound of a murderer coming for him in the dark. Jonah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the choices laid out before him like paths to his own destruction. Give the train to Florence Redmond, and maybe she was the killer, tricking him to get her hands on the embezzled gold. Give it to Dora Eastston and the government, and the real killer might come after him and his family to silence him. Keep the train, and he was an accessory to murder, a man hiding evidence and stolen money. When the first gray light of dawn finally filtered through the window, he slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Dora. He had to see the train. He had to make a decision. The morning mist was thick and cold, clinging to the ground as he walked. The world was silent, muffled. But as he got closer to the clearing where the train sat, a feeling of deep unease settled over him. Something was wrong. He saw it as he approached the first car. Scratches, fresh ones, around the door lock, deep gouges in the wood. Someone had been here. His heart pounding in his chest, he hauled himself inside. He didn't waste any time. He went straight to the first loose floorboard and pried it up. The compartment was empty. He stared into the dark, hollow space, his mind refusing to accept what he was seeing. He scrambled to the next car, then the next, tearing up the floorboards he had so carefully replaced. Empty, empty, empty. The gold was gone. Every last coin. Every single ounce. Whoever did this knew exactly where to look. They'd been methodical, efficient. They'd even taken the time to put the floorboards back, though in their haste, they hadn't been as careful as he had. "Looking for something, Jonah?" The voice came from the doorway of the car. Jonah spun around, his hand instinctively going to the hunting knife on his belt. Thaddeus Sloane stood there, silhouetted against the morning light. But this wasn't the terrified, sweating man who had sold him the train. This Thaddeus stood tall, his posture relaxed, confident. A cold smile played on his lips. And Jonah could see the distinct bulge of a pistol tucked into his coat. "Thaddeus," Jonah breathed. "What are you doing here?" "Just cleaning up a mess," Thaddeus said, stepping into the car. "You were never supposed to look inside, Jonah. You were just supposed to be the simple fool who hauled away the scrap metal." "You took it," Jonah said, the realization hitting him. "You took the gold." "I took what was always mine to begin with," Thaddeus said, his voice smooth and cold. "Edmund Redmond was a thief. He was skimming profits from his own company for years, stashing the money away. I was just repossessing it." "You murdered him for it," Jonah accused, his voice shaking with a mixture of fear and rage. Thaddeus let out a short, harsh laugh that held no humor. "Murder him? Jonah, I didn't kill Edmund Redmond." He took another step closer, the cruel smile widening on his face. "I am Edmund Redmond." The words didn't make sense. They were just sounds. Jonah stared at him, his mind unable to process the statement. "That's impossible," he whispered. "Florence Redmond. She's his daughter." "Florence is my daughter, yes," Redmond said. "And she has no idea that her dear departed father faked his own death 6 months ago and started a new life as a humble shopkeeper." The entire world shifted under Jonah's feet. The terror, the lies, the stolen train. It was all clicking into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. "I needed to disappear," Redmond continued, his voice conversational, as if he were discussing the weather. "The territorial investigators were getting a little too close to my creative accounting methods. Faking my death seemed like the cleanest solution. And it would have worked perfectly if you hadn't come along and stuck your nose where it didn't belong." He drew the pistol from his coat. He didn't point it at Jonah, not yet, but he held it loosely in his hand, a clear and deadly message. "So now I have a problem," Redmond said softly. "You, my daughter, asking too many questions, and that clever little legal clerk from the Capitol." "Dora Eastston," Jonah said, his throat tight. That's the one. Too smart for her own good. She's the one who convinced my Florence that her father was murdered by some phantom embezzler, not that he was the embezzler. She's been digging into the company's finances for months. She's getting too close to the truth. Ice flowed through Jonah's veins. What are you going to do? What I should have done in the first place, Redmond said, his eyes hardening. Disappear for good, but first, I have to erase the trail. He raised the pistol, the dark round hole of the barrel seeming to grow until it was all Jonah could see. I'm truly sorry about this, Jonah. You were never meant to be a part of it. Just as his finger tightened on the trigger, the sound of hoofbeats echoed through the clearing. Fast-moving horses, more than one. They both froze. Through the grimy window of the car, Jonah saw them. Florence Redmond and Dora Eastston riding hard. And behind them were two other men with grim faces and silver star badges pinned to their vests. Territorial marshals. Redmond let out a string of curses under his breath and quickly shoved the pistol back into his coat. Looks like we'll have to finish this chat later. He moved to the back of the car. Not one word of this, Jonah, he hissed. Not if you want to see my daughter again. Or yours. Before Jonah could even react, Redmond had slipped out the rear door and vanished into the trees, as silent as a ghost. Jonah was left standing alone in the empty, plundered train car, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The man Florence was mourning, the man Dora was trying to find justice for, was alive, and he was a cold-blooded killer who had just threatened both their lives. Mr. Riggs! Florence's voice called from outside. Are you in there? He climbed down from the car on legs that felt like jelly. Florence looked fierce and determined. Dora Easton looked worried. And the two marshals looked like they were expecting trouble. Mr. Riggs, the older marshal said, his voice a low gravel. I'm Marshal Daniels. We're here about the Redmond investigation. Miss Eastston believes you found evidence related to his death. Florence stepped forward, her eyes bright with a desperate hope that twisted Jonah's gut into a knot. Evidence that could finally identify my father's killer. The weight of the world settled on Jonah's shoulders. Tell them the truth, and he would shatter Florence's world, revealing her beloved father as a monster. Say nothing, and he would be protecting that monster, letting him escape to kill again. I found something, Jonah said, his voice hoarse. But it's gone. Marshal Daniels took a step closer. Gone? What was it? Records, Jonah lied, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. Financial records, hidden in compartments in the train cars. It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't a complete lie either. Where are they now? Dora Eastston asked, her voice sharp with urgency. Someone came in the night, Jonah said, looking from face to face. They took everything. Florence's face crumpled. Everything? But that was our only hope of finding out who did this to him. Ma'am, Jonah said, his voice softer now. Maybe the truth isn't what you think it is. What do you mean by that? She asked, her voice trembling. He looked into her eyes, saw the grief and the hope warring there, and he just couldn't bring himself to destroy the last good memory she had of her father. Not like this. Sometimes, he said slowly, when you go digging in the past, you find things that were buried for a reason. The second marshal frowned. Mr. Riggs, if you're withholding information in a murder investigation. I'm not, Jonah insisted. All I know is that someone was desperate enough to break in here and steal whatever was hidden. That tells me they're dangerous. All the more reason to find them, Florence said, her resolve hardening. My father deserves justice. Your father, Jonah said, picking his words like he was walking through a field of broken glass, might not be the man you remember. The silence that followed was absolute. Florence just stared at him, her face pale, her expression one of utter shock and betrayal. What? What are you suggesting? She whispered. Before he could answer, a single gunshot cracked through the morning air. It came from the direction of town. Then another. The marshals drew their weapons instantly. "That's Main Street," the younger one said. They swung onto their horses and galloped toward the town without a backward glance, leaving Jonah and Florence standing alone by the silent, empty train. She turned to him, tears welling in her eyes. "You think he was the one, don't you?" she choked out. "You think my father was the criminal?" Jonah met her heartbroken gaze. "Miss Redmond," he said softly. "Some truths are worse than the lies we tell ourselves. But the truth has a way of coming out, whether we want it to or not." More gunshots echoed from the town, sharp and frantic. And Jonah knew. Edmund Redmond's carefully constructed world of lies was finally, violently, coming apart. They rode for town as fast as their horses could carry them, the sound of gunfire growing louder, more chaotic with every hoofbeat. As they reached the outskirts, they saw it. Main Street was a scene of panic. People were running, diving for cover behind barrels and water troughs. The shots were coming from the general store, Thaddeus Sloane's store. "Stay here!" Jonah yelled to Florence, swinging down from his horse. But she was already on the ground, her face a mask of horrified disbelief, running toward the chaos. They found Marshal Daniels crouched behind a horse trough, reloading his revolver. The other marshal, the younger one, was lying face down in the dusty street, a dark, terrible stain spreading across his back. He wasn't moving. "What happened?" Jonah yelled, ducking down beside Daniels. "Sloane," the marshal grunted, not taking his eyes off the store. "He went crazy, opened fire the second we rode in, shot Brady before he could even draw. He's got Miss Eastston and a couple others pinned down in there." Florence let out a strangled gasp. "Dora?" "He's barricaded himself inside," Daniel said. "Yelling nonsense. Says everyone needs to leave Edmund Redmond alone. Says the man is dead and buried and should stay that way." The marshal glanced at Florence, his expression grim. "Ma'am, you need to get back. This is too dangerous." "It's my business more than you could ever know," Florence said, her voice shaking but clear. She stepped out from behind the trough. "Mr. Sloane!" she shouted, her voice ringing out across the suddenly silent street. "Florence, no!" Jonah lunged for her arm, but she shook him off. "Thaddeus Sloane, this is Florence Redmond. I know you can hear me." The shooting stopped. The silence was deafening. For a long, tense moment, nothing happened. Then, a voice drifted from the darkened doorway of the store. "Miss Redmond, you need to get on your horse and ride away from here. Now." "Not until you let those people go!" she yelled back. "And not until you tell me why. Why are you so afraid of me learning the truth about my father?" Another long silence. Then, the front door of the general store creaked open. Thaddeus Sloane, Edmund Redmond, emerged, shoving a terrified Dora Eastston in front of him as a human shield. Her arm was bleeding, staining the sleeve of her dress, but her eyes were filled with defiance, not fear. "Your father," Redmond said, his voice carrying across the street, rough with emotion, "was not the man you thought he was." "Then tell me who he was!" Florence cried, tears streaming down her face. Redmond looked at his daughter. Jonah, watching from behind the trough, saw the man's carefully constructed composure finally shatter. The weight of his lies, of watching his own child mourn for him, of the blood on his hands, it all came crashing down at once. "He was a thief, Florence," he said, his voice cracking. "A liar. A man who stole from his partners and cheated his workers and let good people take the blame for his crimes." "That's not true. It can't be." "It is," he choked out. "And the worst part, the very worst part, is that he was a coward. A coward who faked his own death because he was too afraid to face what he'd done." Florence stared at him, her face a canvas of confusion and dawning, unbearable horror. How could you know these things? How could you know so much about him? Slowly, Redmond lowered his pistol. He gave Dora a gentle push, sending her stumbling toward the marshal's position. He looked up at Florence, his face streaked with dust and tears. "Because, my dear girl," he whispered, his voice breaking completely, "I am your father." The world seemed to stop. Florence staggered back as if she'd been physically struck. "No," she breathed. "No, it's impossible. I buried you. I mourned you." "You buried an empty box," he sobbed, falling to his knees in the middle of the street. "I'm sorry, Florence. I am so, so sorry." Marshal Daniels rose from his cover, his revolver leveled squarely at the broken man in the street. "Edmund Redmond," he said, his voice like iron. "You're under arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and the murder of a United States Marshal." Edmund didn't even look up. He just knelt there in the dust, a man finally, utterly defeated by the weight of his own lies. 3 weeks later, Jonah stood in the marshal's office. Marshal Daniels was counting out gold coins onto his desk, the clink of the metal echoing in the quiet room. The money Redmond had stolen, all of it, had been recovered. It was being returned to the Mountain Rail Company to pay back the people he'd cheated. But the government had authorized a reward. $500, Daniels said, pushing a heavy leather pouch across the desk to Jonah. "For your part in his capture." It was more money than Jonah had ever seen in his life. He picked up the pouch, the weight of it a solid, honest thing in his hands. "What will happen to him?" Jonah asked. 20 years hard labor, Daniels said, leaning back in his chair. "Could have been a hanging offense, killing a marshal. But he cooperated, told us where he'd stashed the rest of the money. Seems he'd been at it for years." "And his daughter? Florence?" "She's staying," the marshal said, a note of respect in his voice. "Says she's going to rebuild the company, make things right. She's already started using her own savings to pay back the workers who lost everything." Jonah nodded. He'd seen her once or twice in town. She looked older, haunted by the truth. But there was a strength in her eyes he hadn't seen before. The strength of someone determined to build something good from the ruins of a lie. As he left the courthouse, Dora Easton was waiting for him on the steps. Her arm was in a sling, but she smiled when she saw him. "Mr. Riggs," she said, "I wanted to thank you. He would have gotten away with it all if it weren't for you." "I just did what was right," Jonah said. "You did more than that," she insisted. "You could have taken that gold and vanished. Instead, you chose justice. Not many men would have made that choice." He thought of the 10 cents, of the impossible fortune he'd held in his hands for just a few days. Sometimes the best deals were the ones you walked away from. "What will you do now?" she asked. "Go home to my wife," he said, a smile touching his lips for the first time in weeks. "Maybe use this money to buy a new plow. Plant a real crop next spring. Live a good, quiet life." Riding home, the reward money heavy in his saddlebag, Jonah reflected on how one impossible bargain had thrown him into a world of murder and deception. He was leaving it a richer man, but the money was the least of it. He'd learned that a deal that seems too good to be true is usually a trap. And the price of that trap is always higher than you can afford. When he reached his cabin, Dora was on the porch, just like that first day. She looked up, her face bright with relief and love. "Well?" she asked. "Did they believe you?" "They did," Jonah said, swinging down from his horse. He pulled the pouch of gold from his bag and poured a stream of gleaming coins into her hands. "Enough to fix the leaky roof, buy all the supplies we need for a dozen winters, and get you that new sewing machine from the catalog." "And the train?" she asked, her eyes wide. "It's going back to work," Jonah said. "Florence is getting the mountain rail line running again." Dora smiled, taking his arm as they walked into their home. "So your 10-cent train turned out to be a good bargain after all." "Better than good," Jonah said, pulling her close. "It taught me that the real treasures aren't the ones you find buried under a floorboard. They're the ones waiting for you on the porch when you come home." As the sun set, Jonah Riggs sat with his wife, counting his blessings instead of his coins, feeling richer than any amount of stolen gold could ever have made him. If you enjoyed this story of greed, deception, and the ultimate triumph of justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more incredible tales from the Wild West. And if you really want to support the channel, consider leaving a comment below telling us what you would have done if you'd found the gold. Your support helps us keep these stories alive.